Evening settled over the mountain in a soft, unhurried way, letting the last traces of daylight fade behind a ridge lined with dark pines. A low wind carried the smell of wet earth long before the rain began, brushing across the stone path that wound toward the temple. As the clouds thickened, the sky dimmed to a deep gray, and the outlines of the buildings grew muted, like shapes inside a memory that had not fully returned. Lanterns glowed faintly along the covered walkways, their warm circles of light trembling against the growing mist. Soon, the first threads of rain appeared, thin and scattered, tapping lightly on the old tiles above. In a small room at the far corner of the temple, the monk sat with his knees folded under him, facing a wooden wall marked by age. The boards beneath him were smooth from years of quiet footsteps, and held a coolness that rose through the thin cushion he used each night. A single lantern rested on a low table beside him. Its flame was steady, but its light was gentle, settling in shallow pools across the floor and softening the edges of everything it touched. Outside, the rain thickened, brushing against the shutters in a slow, steady pulse that deepened the silence inside. The monk's robe hung loosely around his shoulders, the fabric gathering in soft folds along his arms. His hands rested lightly on his knees. He had prepared a cup of warm tea earlier, and though he had not touched it for a while, a faint scent of roasted leaves still lingered in the room. The steam had long disappeared, leaving only a thin ring of warmth at the base of the cup. The rain swelled in sound, then softened again, as if deciding how firmly it wished to fall. Nothing was hurried. Nothing was required from you. Somewhere within the old roof, above the ceiling where beams held the weight of many seasons, water began its slow work. At first it gathered unseen, threading through a narrow seam where two tiles no longer sealed as neatly as they once had. A faint creak whispered through the wooden frame, followed by a single, sharp drop that fell through the lantern's glow. It struck the floor with a clear, delicate tap. The monk did not move, but his gaze shifted toward the darkening spot beginning to bloom on the wood. Another drop followed, then paused. The sound was small, yet it seemed to settle through the entire room. The rain outside brushed steadily along the eaves, creating a soft, sweeping hiss that drifted into the corners of the room. Shadows shifted along the walls, where the lantern's flame trembled in the draft slipping through the old paper screens. The second drop fell, landing close to the first. A tiny ripple shivered through the thin layer of water forming on the floor, catching a faint glimmer from the lantern. The monk breathed in the cool air, letting it settle in his chest, and the boards beneath him gave a quiet, familiar sigh, as if settling deeper into the night. Beyond the room, the temple grounds absorbed the storm. Rain slid down the stone steps in narrow, winding shapes, pooling in shallow hollows before slipping off the edge into soil darkened by the downpour. Bamboo in the grove behind the main hall swayed with soft knocks and rustles, each stalk brushing against its neighbor in an easy, unplanned rhythm. Farther away, the faint toll of a bell arrived through the storm. Its tone softened until it felt more like a memory of sound than the sound itself. It drifted in, lingered for a moment, and faded into the wide breath of the rain. Inside the room, the leak continued with patient regularity. Each drop formed slowly along the hidden beam, swelling round and clear in the lantern's trembling light before falling. The puddle on the floor grew by the smallest increments, its edges spreading in uneven shapes that darkened the wood with quiet persistence. Reflections of the lantern flickered across its surface, stretched thin and wavering, sometimes bright, sometimes barely visible. The ceiling above offered no clue to where the water came from, only the steady rhythm of droplets gathering and letting go. The monk shifted his posture slightly, his sleeve brushing softly against the folds of his robe. The lantern beside him flickered as a draft passed through the seams of the paper wall, making the flame bow for a moment before rising again, steady but subdued. The sound of the rain pressed gently around him, not loud, not intrusive, simply present, like a blanket of thin noise laid over every surface of the night. The boards felt a little cooler beneath him, the tea beside him unmoving, its surface faintly reflecting the lantern in a dull amber curve. Time loosened, unfurling in long stretches between each falling drop. The leak had found its rhythm, slow and unchanging, and the room shaped itself around the sound. The puddle grew until the newest drops landed silently, absorbed without a splash, forming only a brief disturbance before smoothing out again. Lantern light trembled over the surface, catching thin trails of water that wandered along the grooves in the wood. The monk watched without intent, letting the soft motion settle into the folds of his breath, while the storm outside whispered across the roof and wind moved through the bamboo in muted sighs, carrying the scent of rain deeper into the night's cool air. Above the monk's head, another droplet gathered once more at the seam where the tiles thinned. It shone with a faint glow as it clung to the beam, trembling at its edge. For a long moment, it held its shape without falling, round as a small pearl, suspended in a thin breath of lantern light. It stayed that way, unmoving, listening to the rain, waiting in the dim warmth of the room, the night gathering around it as it continued to hold itself at the brink of falling. Rain continued its steady work over the temple roof, tracing soft lines down the sloping tiles before slipping into the darkness around the eaves. Inside the small room, the lantern's glow deepened the warm tones in the wooden floor, even as the spreading puddle began to reshape its reflection. The monk leaned forward slightly, letting the robe fall loose around him as he studied the rhythm of the falling drops. Their sound had grown clearer, no longer tapping directly on the wood, but landing into a thin pool that softened each impact. He reached for a wooden bowl resting on the shelf against the far wall. Its surface was smooth from years of handling, darkened around the rim where water had touched it many times in other seasons. As he lifted it, the lantern light slid along its curved sides, revealing faint marks left by earlier storms. His footsteps were slow and steady as he returned to the center of the room, the boards beneath him giving soft creaks that dissolved into the murmur of the rain. He placed the bowl gently beneath the falling droplets. The first one struck with a hollow, rounded sound, different from the sound against the floor, deeper and more centered. The bowl accepted it quietly, sending a small ripple across its bottom. The monk rested his hand on the edge for a moment, feeling the slight tremor of each falling bead. Outside, wind moved through the bamboo grove, shifting the stalks in long, sweeping arcs. Their leaves brushed against one another in a soft, trembling shimmer that blended with the rainfall. The sound drifted through the open spaces of the temple, following the covered walkways and bending around corners before reaching the monk's room in a softened whisper. The rain did not raise its voice. It simply kept its slow, even rhythm. With the bowl now catching the leak, the puddle on the floor rested still, holding a faint sheen of lantern light that quivered whenever the flame wavered. The monk moved the cushion back an inch to stay clear of the damp boards. His robe rustled softly as he settled again, folding his hands in his lap. Nothing is required from you. Each drop fell into the bowl with a round, steady tone. The sound echoed lightly inside the wooden walls, as if the bowl were speaking a soft, single syllable every few breaths. Ripples formed with each impact, spreading outward in slow circles before fading into the thin layer of collected rainwater. The lantern's reflection glimmered along the surface, its shape bending with every new ripple, always moving, never settling fully. The storm outside gathered strength for a moment, pressing harder against the roof and shutters. A faint draft slipped through the seams, carrying the cool scent of wet leaves and stone into the warm interior of the room. The lantern flame swayed, sending shadows drifting across the walls in gentle arcs. In the far distance, thunder murmured like a voice traveling through many layers of clouds. The monk poured a small amount of tea into his cup, steam no longer rising from it, but warmth still lingering faintly through the clay. He lifted it slowly to his lips, letting the quiet movement mirror the rhythm of the falling drops. The taste was mild and earthy, softened by the cool air. When he set the cup down, a thin ring of reflection circled the liquid inside, trembling with each shift of lantern light. The bowl beneath the leak began to fill gradually, the collected water deepening its tone. Each drop entered the widening pool with a slightly heavier sound, as if the bowl were sinking deeper into its own stillness. A soft mist gathered near the floor where cool air from the door brushed against warmer air inside, creating a faint blur that hovered around the bowl's base. The monk breathed gently, letting the dimness settle around him. Beyond the paper wall, footsteps moved faintly through one of the temple corridors. They were slow, light steps, softened by the wooden boards and barely rising above the sound of the rain. They passed without pause, fading into another section of the building. Soon, there was only the rain again, brushing the roof with slow, unbroken lines. The monk shifted his gaze to the sliding door of his room. A thin seam of gray light showed at its edge. The reflection of lanterns hung in the long walkway outside. The wind brushed the shutters once more, and the paper walls trembled as if stirred by a passing breath. Inside the bowl, another drop fell, then another, each one forming a new ring that shimmered outward across the growing surface of water. The sound of the leak found a quiet rhythm, unhurried and evenly spaced. It folded itself into the room's stillness, becoming part of the night's soft weaving of sounds. The rain, the bamboo, the distant wind. Lantern light dimmed slightly as the oil inside lowered, its glow becoming warmer and more subdued. Shadows on the walls lengthened, drifting slowly as the flame moved. In the corner of the room, the puddle left earlier had begun to thin and lighten as the air cooled. Its surface reflected the lantern in dull fragments, broken by faint ripples from the shifting boards. The monk watched as the remaining water traced its way along the grooves in the wood, forming narrow channels that led into the darker grain. Nothing is required from you. The bowl was now nearly a third full, and its tone deepened each time a drop landed inside. The sound had become softer, more resonant, carrying a low, round echo that lingered beneath the rain. The lantern's reflection quivered inside the bowl with each subtle vibration, bending the flame's shape into elongated lines of gold. The monk's breath moved in quiet harmony with the soft sounds around him, allowing the rhythm to settle deeper into the room. Outside, the storm pressed gently against the temple before easing again, leaving the bamboo to sway in calmer waves. The wind's soft hum drifted through the corridor, brushing the sliding doors before fading away. Inside the room, the next drop gathered along the hidden beam, round and bright at the edge of the seam. It hung there without falling, trembling gently in the lantern's fading glow. Night settled more deeply into the temple as the rain continued its gentle descent, brushing every tile with a soft, unbroken whisper. The lantern in the monk's room dimmed slightly as its oil lowered, sending longer shadows across the wooden walls. The bowl beneath the leak kept its steady rhythm, each drop forming a rounded tone that drifted outward and disappeared into the wider quiet. The monk rose slowly from his cushion, letting the folds of his robe fall into place as he stood. He slid the door open with a muted scrape, revealing the long corridor outside. Lanterns hung at intervals along the walkway, their warm light trembling in the shifting currents of cool air. The boards beneath his feet held the faint scent of the night rain, as though the wood itself had been listening. As he stepped into the corridor, the sound of the leaking water behind him softened until it blended with the broader hush of the storm. The monk walked with even, deliberate steps. Each footfall pressed lightly into the boards, creating a low creak that settled almost immediately into silence. Outside the open side of the walkway, the courtyard lay washed in thin mist. Rain transformed the stone path into a muted sheen, catching slivers of lantern light that stretched and broke as the wind moved. Nothing is required from you. The corridor extended in both directions, disappearing into deeper shadows where the lanterns were spaced farther apart. The wooden beams overhead carried the soft groans of the storm as it shifted over the roof. Water traced narrow trails along the eaves before falling into the courtyard with small, hidden taps. Now and then, the bamboo grove beyond the main hall brushed against itself in gentle, whispering strokes. As he walked, the monk passed a row of closed doors, each one leading to quiet rooms like his own. Some of the paper screens glowed faintly from lanterns within, while others rested in complete darkness. The corridor floor showed thin reflections of the lanterns above, distorted by the grain of the wood and the unevenness of old boards. The reflections stretched and wavered with every subtle move of the flame. At a corner where the walkway bent, a cooler breeze drifted through a narrow gap in the wall. It carried the scent of wet pine and distant soil. The monk paused for a moment, feeling the faint movement of air across his sleeves. Far off, A soft thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the temple, followed by a brief creak that disappeared as quickly as it came. He continued forward, and the corridor began to narrow slightly, as if the structure folded in on itself with age. Lantern light gathered in small pools here, casting the beams in warm gold that faded into darkness only a few steps ahead. His footsteps echoed more clearly in this section, forming a slow rhythm that mingled with the rain outside. The boards sagged gently under his weight, releasing soft groans that sounded older than the night itself. A single window opened to the outside courtyard, its wooden frame worn smooth by many years of sliding open and shut. The monk paused beside it. Rain drifted in at an angle, scattering tiny droplets onto the sill where they glimmered for a moment before disappearing into the wood. The courtyard trees swayed in the passing wind, their branches drawing faint lines across the dim air. The corridor stretched onward, illuminated by one more lantern hung near the far end. Its flame flickered gently, as though responding to the shifting breath of the night. The monk's footsteps approached it in slow measure, each sound soft enough that it dissolved before fully echoing. He reached the lantern and placed a hand lightly on the wooden post beside it, feeling the coolness gathered there from the damp air. Rain slid down the outside wall in thin veils, leaving trails that shimmered briefly before fading. The sound of water along the gutter created a low, continuous murmur that wrapped around the corridor like a loose thread. The bamboo rustled again, its voice shaped by wind passing through hollow stalks. The monk continued walking, the corridor guiding him deeper into the temple's quiet heart. A faint set of footsteps appeared somewhere ahead, so soft they might have been imagined. They moved lightly, barely more than a suggestion of sound. The monk did not quicken his pace, he simply followed the corridor's gentle curve. Lantern light thinned as the walkway turned, dimming until only narrow streaks of reflection remained across the floorboards. He rounded the bend and paused. The corridor here opened into a wider space, where the roof dipped lower, creating a pocket of deeper shadow. A distant lantern cast a faint glimmer along the far beam, leaving most of the walkway in quiet darkness. The monk breathed slowly, listening as the soft footsteps ahead faded into the stillness, absorbed entirely by the long wooden hall. The rain outside pressed gently against the roof again, steady and unbroken. The corridor held its dim glow, narrowing toward the soft dark where the echo of footsteps had disappeared. A thin line of pale mist drifted along the floorboards, rising and falling with the cool breath of the night. At the far end of the walkway, a lantern flickered once, then steadied, trembling faintly in the draft as the corridor faded into deeper shadow. Rain pressed more softly against the temple roof now, settling into a steady whisper that moved across the tiles like a long breath stretched through the night. The corridor behind the monk rested in a dim hush, its lantern swaying slightly in the cool draft that slipped through every seam of the old wood. As he stepped into the kitchen hall, the air shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of dried leaves and warm clay. Shadows clung to the beams above, stirred only when the lantern flames trembled. The kitchen was simple, shaped by years of quiet movements rather than change. A wooden counter stretched along one wall, worn smooth where countless cups had been placed and lifted. Clay jars rested in neat rows, their lids tied with thin cords that swayed whenever the night wind found a way inside. A kettle hung above a small charcoal bed, where embers glowed a muted red. Though the fire was nearly gone, it still held enough warmth to heat the water waiting inside. The monk knelt beside the kettle and lifted it carefully. The slight motion sent a soft rush of warmth into the air, carrying the scent of steam that had begun to gather. He set the kettle onto a low stand and reached for a small pouch of tea leaves. When he loosened the string, the faint aroma of roasted leaf drifted out, earthy and calm. Nothing is required from you. He poured a small handful of leaves into a clay pot. Their dry edges rustled softly, settling into the bottom with a sound almost too light to hear. The monk tipped the kettle, letting water flow in a smooth, steady stream that darkened the leaves and sent thin spirals of steam rising into the lantern glow above. The pot warmed quickly beneath his hands, and the surface of the water trembled with subtle ripples as the tea unfurled its color. Rain brushed the shutters with a new rhythm, gentle and persistent. The wood absorbed each drop as if in deep conversation with the storm. Through a narrow window, the courtyard appeared blurred by mist, bamboo shifting slightly in the wind. Their slender shapes cast wavering shadows on the stone floor, shadows that lengthened and shortened with the passing breeze. The monk moved to a small alcove where cups were kept. He chose one with a smooth, rounded lip and a pale glaze that caught the lantern's warmth in soft reflections. When he returned to the pot, steam rose gently from the spout, catching the air like a thin ribbon of cloud. He poured a cup, watching the liquid settle into a dark amber pool. The surface glowed faintly, trembling whenever a drop of water struck the roof above. He set the cup on the counter beside the lantern. The steam climbed quietly into the dimness, curling in slow, delicate loops before fading into the cool air. The scent of tea mingled with the faint smell of rain-soaked pine drifting in through the window. The monk breathed in slowly, letting the warmth gather around him. A faint creak passed through the rafters above, as if a beam had shifted to ease the weight of the storm. Footsteps sounded briefly in the hallway beyond the kitchen. Soft and unhurried, they moved from one board to the next with gentle pressure, then faded around a distant corner. The monk remained still, listening to the echo dissolve. The temple often carried footsteps at night, each one finding its own path through the long wooden halls. He lifted the cup and held it in both hands. The warmth seeped into his palms, slow and steady. Steam brushed lightly against his face, disappearing as soon as it touched the cool night air. The tea settled with a faint shimmering of color as ripples traveled across the surface, then softened into stillness. Outside, the wind returned in a quieter breath, stirring the bamboo with a faint rustling murmur. Their leaves tapped one another in soft rhythms that paired with the sweeping whisper of rain. The lantern's glow swayed gently with the movement of the draft entering through the cracked window. Shadows on the counter shifted in long arcs, bending across the grain of the wood before dissolving into darker corners. The monk placed the cup down and let his fingers rest lightly on the wooden surface. The counter was cool beneath his skin, carrying the touch of the night air. A small pool of condensation formed around the base of the cup, spreading outward in a thin ring that reflected the faintest shimmer of lantern light. The room grew quieter, shaped only by the rain and the soft hum of cooling embers. He lifted the kettle once more, tilting it carefully to gather the last warmth inside. A thin line of steam escaped through the spout, curling upward with delicate patience. The monk returned the kettle to its place, letting the iron settle gently onto the stand. The faint sound of metal meeting wood echoed softly through the quiet kitchen. The tea continued to steam beside him, its surface trembling subtly with each change in the lantern's glow. The color deepened in the cup as the leaves released the last of their warmth into the water. A thin trail of vapor drifted upward, rising toward the beams overhead where it thinned into the stillness. Nothing is required from you. Outside the kitchen, the corridor lanterns flickered as the wind shifted direction. A faint crackle of rain against the shutters changed into a softer, more scattered pattern. The bamboo bent slightly, then eased back, their movement mirrored in the wavering shadows on the kitchen walls. The temple felt as though it were breathing in slow, steady cycles, shaped entirely by the night rain. The monk reached for the cup again, holding it for a moment without lifting it. His eyes rested on the steam rising from the surface, watching it twist and loosen into the air. Each movement of the vapor was gentle, unhurried, disappearing without a trace as soon as it thinned. The lantern's flame bowed once more in the draft, sending a faint shimmer across the cup. The rain softened further, slowing its rhythm against the roof. The sound became lighter, more diffused, as though the night itself were settling into deeper stillness. The monk let his gaze wander to the small window where a single droplet clung to the edge of the frame. It held the light in a tiny, trembling reflection, round and clear, waiting without falling. Rain drifted in thin, scattered lines across the night as the monk stepped out from the kitchen hall and onto the covered walkway. The air here was colder, rising from the stone path below and carrying the faint scent of wet pine from the mountainside. Lanterns hung along the rafters at steady intervals, their flames bending gently in the draft that wound through the open corridor. The wood beneath his feet felt cool and slightly damp from the mist that had crept in. The walkway opened directly toward the bamboo grove that bordered the back of the temple. In the dim light, the bamboo appeared as tall, swaying silhouettes, their slender trunks rising from soft earth darkened by the rain. A light wind moved through them, brushing each stalk in slow, deliberate waves. The sound they made was quiet yet layered, a soft chorus of hollow knocks and rustling leaves that drifted into the corridor with calming insistence. The monk paused near the railing, resting one hand lightly on the smooth wooden beam. From here he could feel the breath of the night more clearly, the coolness settling around his sleeves, the mist gathering near the ground. Small puddles dotted the stone path just beyond the walkway, each one holding a trembling reflection of lantern light stretched into thin, wavering shapes. The bamboo continued their gentle sway, answering the wind with patient movement. A cluster of leaves brushed against each other with a sound like distant whispering. The breeze shifted direction, turning the bamboo slightly so their shadows reached farther across the stones. Above the grove, clouds moved slowly, revealing a faint glow where the moon pressed behind them. The monk lowered his gaze and watched the faint movement of fog drifting between the bamboo trunks, rising in pale ribbons that curled upward before dispersing into the open air. "Nothing is required from you." The walkway creaked softly as he took another step. His robe brushed lightly against the railing, collecting beads of moisture from the mist. The night air carried the steady pulse of rain from rooftops deeper in the temple, each droplet tracing its own path down carved gutters and wooden posts. Somewhere nearby, water fell from an overhang in a rhythmic trickle, the sound blending seamlessly with the bamboo's shifting voice. A lantern farther down the walkway flickered, sending a warm ripple of light along the smooth grain of the railing. The glow settled over the monk's hands before fading gently as the flame steadied again. He watched the bamboo lean in unison with the passing wind, their silhouettes bowing and rising with unhurried grace. Shadows from their movement stretched across the courtyard in long, quiet arcs. A thin gust of wind slid through the corridor, stirring the lanterns once more. Their faint swaying caused the reflections on the stone path to tremble like disturbed pond water. The bamboo responded with a soft cascade of knocks, the hollow trunks striking each other with gentle insistence. The monk let the sound settle around him, feeling the cool breath of the grove drift across the walkway. Rain thickened slightly, creating narrow streams along the edges of the tiles overhead. Water dripped steadily from a corner of the roof into the garden soil, darkening it in growing circles. The bamboo leaves collected droplets that gathered at their tips, shining for a moment before falling quietly into the earth below. Mist curled around the lower stalks, shaping soft columns of pale gray that shifted with every movement of air. The monk took a few steps farther along the walkway, following the line of lanterns. Each of them cast a small pool of gold on the floorboards, turning the dark wood warm for a brief span before letting the night reclaim it. His footsteps remained steady, barely rising above the sound of wind and bamboo. The corridor's wooden beams groaned in response to the night's moisture, slow and subdued. He paused again, where the railing overlooked a deeper section of the grove. This part was denser, the bamboo clustered more closely together, as if leaning toward an unseen center. Their tall frames swayed with a rhythmic calm that appeared almost synchronized. Leaves brushed each other in whispering waves, moving like breath through long grass. The monk exhaled softly, his breath merging with the cool air. A distant bell rang once, muted by the rain, its tone drifting in a faint arc across the courtyard before settling into the bamboo's quiet rustle. The sound thinned as it traveled, dissolving into the grove until only the wind remained. Lantern light flickered across his sleeve as the draft shifted once more. Closer to the earth, a patch of fog glided between the bamboo stalks. It moved in languid drifts, gathering around the base of the trees before slipping away again. The monk's eyes followed its slow path, watching as the mist parted briefly around a stone marker half hidden by the grove. Its surface glimmered faintly with rainwater, then faded into the shadows as the fog returned. The wind brushed the grove again, firmer this time, causing the bamboo to lean with a long, sweeping sigh. Leaves scattered droplets as they moved, creating a delicate spray that caught the lantern light along the walkway. A low creak sounded from the beams overhead, responding to the shifting weight of the night. The monk remained still, letting the moment pass through him with gentle ease. The grove settled once more, its movement reduced to a slow, swaying rhythm. Rain softened into a thin veil, drifting down in nearly silent strokes. The monk's gaze rested on one tall stalk of bamboo near the front of the grove, its trunk bending ever so slightly in the breeze, a bead of water forming at the tip of a leaf. It grew rounder, heavier, trembling in the lantern's dim glow as the wind paused around it. Rain gathered more thickly along the temple's sloping roofs as the night deepened, each drop moving with patient certainty down the worn tiles before slipping into the darkness below. The monk turned from the bamboo grove and walked the length of the covered walkway, his steps a gentle counterpoint to the soft sound of water falling from every eave. Lanterns trembled above him, their light bending in slow arcs with each breath of wind that found its way through the wooden beams. Mist drifted along the courtyard stones, rising and settling in quiet, unhurried motions. As he made his way toward the outer gate, the air grew cooler, holding the faint scent of wet stone and pine carried from the mountain path beyond the walls. The walkway narrowed here, the lanterns spaced farther apart, leaving long stretches of dimness between them where the wood absorbed the night. Rain swept across the open side of the corridor in soft, slanted lines, brushing lightly against the edge of the floorboards. The monk's robe moved with the draft, gathering small droplets that clung to the hem. The large wooden gate at the end of the walkway stood partly open, allowing a thin wash of night air to slip through the gap. Beyond it lay the stone steps descending toward the forest path, now glazed with rain and faintly shining under the muted lantern glow. The downpour softened the edges of everything beyond the threshold, turning the shapes of trees and distant rocks into wavering silhouettes. The monk paused just before the gate, sensing the shift in the air as something approached. A figure emerged slowly from the curtain of rain. The person moved with measured steps, each footfall placed carefully on the slick stones. Their robe clung to them, soaked through, the water tracing dark lines down the fabric. The monk waited without speaking, listening to the soft patter of raindrops slipping from the traveler's sleeves as they finally reached the shelter of the gate. Mist curled around their ankles before drifting into the courtyard behind them. The traveler stopped a short distance away and bowed, their breath visible in the cool night air. A thin strand of hair clung to their cheek, heavy with rain, trembling slightly in the draft that passed through the corridor. They lifted their head and met the monk's gaze briefly, eyes soft, quiet, carrying the weight of long travel without asking for anything directly. For a moment, the only sound between them was the steady, even fall of the storm. Nothing is required from you. The monk returned the bow with gentle grace. His sleeves drew small arcs through the air as he motioned toward the covered walkway, inviting the traveler into the deeper shelter of the temple grounds. Rain continued to fall against the gate, sending fine sprays of water into the open space as the wind shifted. The traveler stepped forward, shoes brushing against the wooden threshold with a soft, waterlogged sound. As they entered the walkway, the lantern above flickered, its flame bowing low before rising again with delicate patience. Light washed across the traveler's robe in warm, uneven shapes, revealing droplets clinging to the fabric like scattered beads of glass. Their footsteps were nearly silent, softened by the dampness that had settled into their clothing. A thin trail of water followed behind them, marking where each step had rested. The corridor accepted their presence without disturbance. Shadows shifted gently along the walls as the pair moved deeper into the temple, the monk guiding the way with quiet, unhurried strides. Rain pressed steadily against the outer edge of the walkway, forming small streams that traveled along the railing and dripped onto the stones below. The bamboo grove whispered faintly in the distance, carried softly on the wind. When they reached a lantern-hung post where the walkway turned inward, the monk stopped. The traveler paused beside him, their breath still faintly visible in the cool air. Water continued to slide from their robe in thin rivulets, pooling quietly on the wooden boards. The monk lifted a hand and spoke a single, simple line, no louder than the patter of rain around them. "Come inside." The traveler nodded once. Their own voice arrived as barely more than a whisper, soft enough to be mistaken for the quiet sigh of rain through the rafters. "Thank you." After speaking, they lowered their gaze again, their shoulders rising with a slow, steady breath as they followed the monk toward the inner rooms. They passed through a section of walkway where the lanterns were dimmer, their light pulled thin by the shifting drafts. Shadows moved across the walls in long, bending shapes, stretching with each flicker of flame. The traveler brushed a hand lightly against the railing, steadying themselves as they walked, leaving behind small droplets that shone briefly before sliding to the floor. The courtyard on their left grew calmer now as the storm eased slightly. Rain still fell, but in finer strokes, almost like threads laid gently across the night. Mist thickened near the ground, drifting upward in soft plumes that curled around the bases of the columns. A faint echo of water dripping from the far roof carried through the air, merging with the lighter rustle of bamboo. The monk guided the traveler toward the quieter rooms near his own. Their steps slowed as the walkway narrowed once more, lanterns casting warmer circles of light that felt closer, more intimate in the surrounding darkness. The traveler's robe no longer dripped as heavily, though a thin shimmer of moisture still clung to its folds. Their breath had softened, no longer rising with the same effort as when they arrived at the gate. They reached a small open space where the walkway met the entrance to the monk's quarters. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing the dim lantern glow inside, and the faint sound of the bowl beneath the leak, still catching each drop with rounded, patient notes. The traveler paused at the threshold, their silhouette framed by the warm light behind the paper walls. The monk stepped aside, motioning gently for them to enter. Rain brushed the walkway again with renewed softness, as though encouraging the moment's quiet. The traveler lifted their head, letting their gaze rest briefly on the lantern light drifting from within the room. A single droplet of water slid from the traveler's sleeve, falling in a soft arc toward the wooden floor, trembling in the glow just before it landed. The room greeted them with warm, muted light as the monk slid the door open a little farther. The lantern on the low table flickered softly, casting gentle curves of gold across the wooden floor. The bowl beneath the leak continued its slow rhythm, each drop forming a rounded sound that seemed to deepen as the room welcomed another presence. The traveler stepped inside carefully, water still tracing thin lines down their robe. Mist followed them for a moment, drifting in from the walkway, before settling against the walls and dissolving into the stillness. The room's faint scent of tea lingered in the air, warm and earthy, untouched since the monk had left to walk the corridors. Outside, the rain returned to a steadier pattern, brushing the eaves with calm persistence. Nothing was hurried. Nothing is required from you. The monk moved toward the low table and lifted the clay pot he had prepared earlier. Though the steam had softened, a quiet warmth still rested inside it. He poured tea into 2 cups, the liquid forming gentle ripples before calming into dark amber pools. The faint glow of the lanterns settled along their surfaces, bending with each tremble of the flame. The traveler knelt slowly on the cushion opposite him. Their robe clung to them in dark, heavy folds, still carrying the night's rain. They held their hands close together for warmth, breath soft and steady in the dim light. Droplets slid from the ends of their sleeves, landing with almost silent taps on the floor that blended into the rhythm of the leaking roof. The monk offered one of the cups. The traveler accepted it with both hands, fingers curling gently around the clay. A thin wisp of remaining steam rose between them, catching the lantern light in a brief silver thread before disappearing. The warmth from the cup eased across the traveler's knuckles, quiet and steady. They sat without speaking. The bowl beneath the leak marked time with rounded echoes, each drop deepening the calm that filled the room. Shadows shifted across the walls in slow arcs as the lantern swayed in the faint draft slipping through the wooden seams. Outside, bamboo rustled with soft, wandering movements, their distant whispers reaching the room in gentle pauses. The traveler lifted the cup slightly, letting the warmth rise toward their face. After a long, quiet breath, they spoke a single line, voice low and softened by the night. "It was a long road." The monk nodded once, the motion small and unforced. He took a sip of tea, letting the warmth move through him with steady ease. The traveler followed, drinking slowly, both hands wrapped around the cup as though anchoring the moment. The rain pressed gently against the roof overhead, steady and patient. Between them, the lantern's glow deepened, settling in soft layers across the table, the cups, the folds of their robes. The bowl caught another drop, then another, sound round and certain as ripples formed and disappeared. Mist along the sliding door moved like a thin, drifting veil, stirred by the quiet breath of the night. The traveler lowered their cup slightly, gaze resting on the bowl beneath the leak. Their expression remained calm, softened by exhaustion and the gentle warmth of the tea. A small ripple formed in the water as another drop fell, bending the lantern's reflection into a trembling shape. The monk watched the surface settle again, slow and smooth. Outside the paper walls, a faint shift in the wind carried the sound of rain along the walkway, changing its rhythm for a brief moment before returning to steady, whispering strokes. The lantern trembled in the draft, its flame bowing lightly before lifting once more. Shadows bent with it, lengthening across the wooden floor in uneven patches. For a while, neither of them moved. The room embraced their quiet, shaping itself around the soft sounds. Rain, bamboo, the bowl, the rustle of robes settling into stillness. The monk's breath remained even, aligned with the rhythm of falling water. The traveler's shoulders eased as their robe slowly shed the last of its gathered droplets onto the floor. Another drop gathered overhead along the hidden beam, clinging to the edge of the seam. It swelled, brightened in the lantern's glow, and held its shape for a long, unhurried moment. The two cups sat between them, faint steam still clinging to their rims, rising in nearly invisible threads. The droplet trembled, full and round, waiting quietly in the warm circle of lantern light. Rain softened into a finer mist as the night deepened, its sound thinning into a delicate whisper that drifted through the wooden seams of the room. The monk and the traveler sat near the low table, the lantern resting between them in a small pool of warm, steady light. The bowl beneath the leak filled at an unhurried pace, each drop falling with a deeper tone than before. A faint shimmer gathered along the water's surface, stretching and bending with every tremble of the flame. The traveler held their cup with both hands, warming their fingers slowly. The last traces of rainwater slipped from the edges of their sleeves, forming small beads that rolled silently onto the floor. Their breathing had softened, no longer rising with the weight of the forest path they had walked to reach the temple. Lantern light shifted gently along their face as the flame leaned and returned, shaping calm shadows beneath their eyes. The monk poured a little more tea into his own cup, watching the steam rise in thin, wavering lines. It curled upward for a breath before dissolving into the cooler air that pressed in from the hallway. Outside, bamboo leaves clattered softly, each sound subdued by the storm's gentler mood. The quiet felt layered, shaped by rain, wood, and the small movements of two people sharing the same stillness. The traveler set their cup down with care. The clay made a faint, rounded sound as it touched the table. They drew in a slow breath, gathering their thoughts not into a story, but into something simpler. When they spoke, it was only one brief sentence, carried on a voice softened by distance and night. "I left earlier than planned." No explanation followed. The words rested in the room like a single drop of water placed on still surface. The monk offered no reply, only the quiet steadiness of his presence. The bowl beneath the leak caught another drop. A soft, hollow tone echoed briefly before dissolving into the deeper quiet. "Nothing is required from you." The traveler's gaze drifted to the sliding door. Mist pressed lightly against its paper surface, moving in slow, cloud-like shapes as the cold air shifted outside. Lantern light painted soft gold across those drifting forms, giving them the appearance of passing shadows. The rain beyond grew lighter still, so thin at times that it could barely be heard. The night held the temple in a deep, grounded calm. The monk lifted his cup and took a small sip. Warmth traveled through him in quiet, steady lines. Outside, a loose shutter tapped lightly against its frame with the rhythm of the wind. Bamboo rustled once more, sending a faint wave of sound through the grove like breath moving across hollow reeds. The traveler's eyes followed the shadow play on the door, their features softening with each passing moment. Another drop gathered along the hidden beam overhead. It trembled at the edge, illuminated by the lantern's glow. The bowl already held a wide sheen of reflection, rippling gently as the leak continued its slow work. The traveler watched the drops descent as though listening to an untold memory carried quietly between breaths. Their posture eased, shoulders lowering in quiet relief without words. The monk shifted his sleeve slightly, the fabric rustling with a subtle texture that blended into the room's stillness. The lantern flame bent in a small draft, stretching its light across the floorboards in thin, wavering lines. The traveler rested one hand on the table, palm open, fingers relaxed. Their robe had nearly dried except for the edges near the hem, where water still gathered in dark patches. The room held its silence without heaviness. It felt spacious inside the quiet, shaped only by breath, by the lantern's faint hum, and by the bowl's patient rhythm. Shadows leaned gently along the walls as the flame swayed again. The traveler closed their eyes briefly, as if listening for something distant but not urgent. The monk watched without expectation, letting the night unfold in its own soft measures. A faint shift of wind moved through the walkway outside, pressing lightly against the door. Mist stirred again, swirling in thin patterns that drifted upward and thinned near the ceiling. The lantern glow deepened as the flame steadied, warming the room's dim corners. The monk set his cup down beside the traveler's, the two vessels forming a quiet pair on the table. The drop overhead grew full once more, its rounded form holding tightly to the edge of the seam. Lantern light curved across its surface, giving it the glow of a small, trembling star suspended above the waiting bowl. It held for a long moment, untouched, unmoving, listening to rain and footsteps already forgotten in the night. Then it released, falling through the warm air. The rain thinned into a gentle murmur as the monk slid the door open again, allowing the traveler to follow him into the corridor. Lantern light stretched into the walkway, forming soft patterns across the floorboards. The leak continued its patient rhythm inside the room, its rounded echoes fading as the door closed. Mist drifted along the outer edge of the corridor, rising from the courtyard stones in slow, wavering strands. Their footsteps moved with quiet care, softened by the lingering damp in the wood. The traveler's robe brushed faintly against the railing as they walked, leaving behind a thin trail of moisture that caught the lantern light in brief glimmers. Wind pressed through the bamboo grove with a steadier touch now, carrying the soft rustle of leaves through the open side of the walkway. The sound followed them like a calm, distant tide. The monk led the way toward the main hall, where the temple's broad wooden beams rose into the darkness overhead. As they approached the entrance, shadows deepened and the air grew cooler, held by wide, open spaces untouched by lantern warmth. The hall waited, like a quiet body of water at night, its surface unbroken and still. Nothing is required from you. He slid the heavy door aside, just far enough for them to enter. The dim lantern inside cast a wide, yet subdued glow across the polished floor. The boards reflected the light in muted streaks, their smooth surface revealing the soft passing of countless footsteps over many seasons. The monk stepped forward, his movement slow, allowing the air to settle around him before the next footfall. The traveler entered behind him. Their breath echoed faintly in the large space, softened almost immediately by the hall's open height. Wooden pillars rose from the floor in tall, steady lines, disappearing into the darkness above where lantern light could not reach. The far wall held a series of sliding screens, painted with faded ink strokes of mountains and trees, their forms softened by age and shadow. A single lantern rested on a raised platform near the center of the hall. Its flame moved with small, deliberate motions, sending shadows across the pillars in long, curved waves. The monk approached and paused near it. The traveler stood a few paces behind, letting their eyes adjust to the dimness. The hall's vast emptiness seemed to cradle every sound, no matter how small. They listened. The rain outside was distant here, softened into a broad whisper that pressed against the temple walls with gentle persistence. The bamboo grove murmured faintly beyond the outer corridors, its voice reaching the hall only in softened fragments. Their own movements, even the slow shift of cloth along their sleeves, carried a subtle echo before dissolving into the wider stillness. The monk lifted the lantern slightly. Its glow reached a few steps farther, revealing more of the floor's smooth surface and a deeper stretch of shadows along the opposite beams. The traveler stepped forward, their footfall creating a low, brief echo that drifted across the room like a ripple on still water. When they stopped, the sound faded into the ceiling, leaving the hall quiet once more. They walked together through the center of the space. Their shadows moved in long, bending shapes across the polished boards, stretching and shrinking as they passed beneath the lantern's narrow reach. The air inside the hall held a faint chill, one that carried the scent of old cedar and rain-soaked wind pressing through distant seams. A loose beam overhead creaked lightly, adjusting to the night's moisture. The traveler's gaze drifted upward. Darkness gathered thickly in the high rafters, the lantern too distant to touch the ceiling. The faint outline of beams showed in quiet intervals, shaped only by the suggestion of shadow on shadow. A small, drifting draft moved through the hall, brushing their sleeves and stirring the flame into a thin, flickering curve. The monk stopped near one of the far pillars. He placed the lantern on the floor, letting its glow expand into a wider circle. The pillar's surface held shallow grooves and knots that caught the light in uneven textures. The traveler reached out and let their fingers hover near the grain without touching it, as though feeling the cool air that passed along its surface. Echoes shifted faintly as they moved again. The sound was never loud, never sharp, only a softened imprint of their presence across the hall's quiet body. Each step carried a subtle resonance that faded as soon as it formed. The monk's robe trailed a quiet whisper along the floor, blending with the low hum of rain outside. Near the back of the hall, a narrow slit window opened to the night. Mist pressed lightly against it, carried upward by the wind from the courtyard below. The traveler paused there, watching the pale shapes drift against the frame. The window allowed only a sliver of the outside world to enter, just enough to sense the movement of the storm without seeing more than its faintest outline. The monk joined them, resting one hand lightly on the wooden frame. Together they watched the mist shift against the glass. Bamboo shadows flickered faintly in the distance whenever the wind found a stronger path through the grove. The hall behind them remained still, its emptiness embracing every sound without resistance. A lantern at the far end of the hall trembled in a subtle draft. Its glow flickered, bending along the floor in a long, thin ribbon of gold that reached toward the traveler's feet. The ribbon wavered, stretched, and slowly faded as the flame steadied itself again. The monk lowered his gaze. A shallow pool of reflection had formed on the polished boards near the lantern, shaped by the faint moisture carried in on their robes. The reflection trembled as another small draft passed through the open rafters high above. The rain eased into a thin whisper as the monk and the traveler stepped out of the hall and returned to the long covered walkway. The corridor felt wider now, its wooden beams holding the cool breath of the night more gently. Lanterns trembled along the rafters, their light drawing soft lines across the floorboards. Mist drifted upward from the courtyard stones, folding around the columns in pale, slow-moving ribbons. The monk paused beneath the overhang, resting one hand lightly on the railing. The traveler stood beside him, their robe now only faintly damp, carrying the last traces of the rain. The air held a quiet coolness that settled softly against their skin. The bowl-like tones from the far-off leak in the monk's room were barely audible here, softened by distance and the wide hush of the temple grounds. A shift in the clouds revealed the moon, first as a dim, blurred glow behind thick gray, then as a pale crescent emerging with steady patience. Its light washed across the courtyard, turning the wet stones into soft patches of silver. Bamboo shadows lengthened with the moon's rise, their shapes bending across the ground in gentle arcs. The breeze carried the faint scent of wet leaves and distant earth. Nothing is required from you. The traveler lifted their head slightly, watching as moonlight gathered on the temple's old roof. The tiles glistened in uneven lines, each one holding a different sheen depending on how the light touched it. Drops of water clung to the edges of the eaves, round and trembling. Now and then one fell, descending through the moonlit air with a softness that felt almost weightless. The monk stepped forward, moving toward a section of the courtyard covered by a lower roof. The tiles above this area had weathered differently, more textured, more irregular, shaped by seasons of wind and sun. Moonlight caught the uneven surfaces, creating thin streaks of brightness that shifted subtly as clouds drifted overhead. Mist rose gently along the roofline, holding the light in faint, wavering halos. They walked along the perimeter of the courtyard, each of their steps measured and quiet. The traveler's footsteps created a low, muted resonance against the wooden boards. The monk's robe brushed softly against the railing, leaving behind a faint line of moisture that shimmered briefly in the moonlight. A cool draft slipped through the open side of the walkway, carrying with it the delicate rustle of bamboo. The moon climbed higher, its light strengthening into a pale wash that made shadows more distinct. The edges of the tiled roofs became clearer, revealing chips and uneven lines formed by years of rain. Water still clung to the highest ridges, glinting like a narrow string of pearls. The traveler watched as one bead grew heavy and detached, falling in a slow arc that mirrored the curve of the roof before vanishing into the mist below. A faint creak rose from the rafters overhead as the wood adjusted to the cooling night. The sound drifted along the corridor in a gentle wave before dissolving into the wider quiet. The monk rested his hand briefly on the post beside him, feeling the smoothness worn into it by countless evenings like this one. Moonlight slid across his sleeve, bending around the soft folds of his robe. They reached a point where the walkway met a small open landing. From here, the entire length of the main roof could be seen. The tiles formed long, sloping lines that rose like gentle waves toward the upper ridge. The moonlight traced these lines with soft silver, revealing the delicate movement of water still seeping from between the tiles. Tiny rivulets formed slow paths downward, reflecting the light in narrow, wavering streaks. The traveler exhaled softly. The sound was barely audible, yet in the quiet of the courtyard, it lingered with gentle clarity. Mist brushed past their ankles, curling in faint loops before drifting toward the far side of the temple. The bamboo responded to a mild gust, their leaves brushing together with a sound like distant paper being folded and unfolded. The monk stepped closer to the edge of the landing. He lifted his gaze toward the highest corner of the roof, where moonlight gathered most strongly. More of the clouds parted, allowing the pale light to widen across the tiles. The ridge glowed faintly, holding a soft radiance that slipped across its curved line and onto the surfaces below. The mind may rest now. A thin stream of water slid from the upper ridge, dividing into smaller drops as it met the edge. Each one formed slowly, swelling round and bright as moonlight settled into it. The traveler watched their quiet shimmering, eyes following the way each drop trembled before letting go. The motion was simple, steady, unhurried. One droplet clung longer than the rest. It held its shape, trembling on the edge of the tile, capturing a small reflection of the moon inside its curved surface. It brightened as the draft shifted gently across it, swaying in the cool air. It remained there, suspended, waiting on the silver edge of the old roof. The monk and the traveler returned along the covered walkway, their steps slow as the moonlit courtyard faded behind them. Rain had thinned, almost to silence, leaving only the occasional drops sliding from the corners of the roof. Lanterns flickered with a gentler steadiness now, their flames lifting and falling in soft rhythms shaped by the night's cooling air. Mist drifted low across the stones, folding itself into the wooden rails and pillars. As they approached the monk's room, the faint, rounded sound of the bowl greeted them again. Each distant note echoed quietly through the corridor, softened by the wood and the thin veil of damp air. The traveler paused briefly at the doorway, listening. Their robe had dried enough that its weight felt lighter, though the faint scent of rain still clung to the cloth. The monk slid the door open, allowing the warm lantern glow from inside to spill gently into the walkway. The room looked slightly different now. Shadows had shifted across the walls while they were gone. The lantern's flame was lower, more golden, trembling with a delicate uncertainty. The bowl beneath the leak had filled enough to deepen its tone, yet something else had changed. The spot on the ceiling where the leak once formed was now dry. No drop gathered there. The seam looked unchanged, but the water no longer fell from it. Instead, a faint sound dripped from a new point near the edge of the beam. The monk stepped inside and tilted his head upward. Another drop formed there, slightly to the right of where it had fallen before, and released itself without hesitation, landing on the wooden floor just beside the bowl with a soft tap. A new, dark patch began to spread slowly where it hit. "Nothing is required from you." The traveler followed him in, their gaze shifting between the old spot and the new. The monk picked up the bowl, its surface trembling slightly with the movement of the water inside. He held it steady for a moment, watching the faint ripples form and fade across the surface. Then he placed the bowl beneath the new fall point, adjusting its position with practiced care until the next drop landed squarely inside it with a deep, rounded echo. The sound filled the room for a brief moment before dissolving back into the quiet. The monk returned to his cushion, his robe folding around him in soft, sweeping lines. The traveler settled nearby, resting their hands lightly on their knees. The lantern flickered again in the slight draft that slipped between the doorframe and the floor, casting long, shifting shadows across the boards. The new leak found its rhythm quickly. Drops gathered along the beam with patient consistency, each one brightening in the lantern glow before falling. The bowl caught them with an echo that sounded slightly different now, deeper, more resonant than before. The surface of the collected water bobbed gently with every impact, sending round ripples outward that touched the curved walls of the bowl before receding into stillness. Outside, the bamboo rustled in quieter waves, responding to the softened wind. A lone drop fell from a roof edge and struck the railing outside the room, creating a single bright ring of sound that faded into the night. Inside, the shifting leak added a calm variation to the room's soundscape, as though the roof itself exhaled in a new direction. A faint creak in the ceiling accompanied the next drop, the wood adjusting to the night's cooling air. The traveler's eyes settled on the bowl. Moonlight slipped through the narrow seam in the sliding door, mixing with the lantern glow to create a dim shimmer across the surface of the water. The reflection trembled with each falling drop, bending the light into soft, wavering lines. The monk watched it too, his gaze calm, unhurried, taking in the small change in the rhythm as though it had always been part of the night. Another shift in the wood overhead drew their attention. A thin thread of moisture crawled along the beam, glistening in the half-light. It settled at the very edge of the wood, forming another droplet beside the one that had just fallen. This second drop gathered more slowly, swelling with a faint brightness that pulsed each time the lantern flame bowed in the draft. The monk reached for the bowl again, moving it slightly to accommodate the new alignment. The traveler watched his careful motion, noticing the subtle way the water inside the bowl moved with each change. Ripples crossed and recrossed, forming delicate patterns that shifted as soon as they appeared. "Nothing is required from you." The ceiling creaked once more. A tiny bead formed farther along the seam, just a little beyond the monk's reach. It was too small to fall yet, but its presence hinted that the leak might wander again before the night ended. The traveler looked up at it, the droplet catching a narrow line of moonlight that slanted through the open seam in the paper wall. It trembled there, holding onto the wood with delicate insistence, gathering its weight one quiet breath at a time. The room settled into a deeper quiet as the new leak found its steady rhythm. Rain outside had softened into scattered drops that landed without urgency on the temple roof, creating a faint, irregular pattern that rose and fell like distant breathing. The lantern in the corner glowed low and warm, its flame bending gently with each draft that crossed the floor. The bowl beneath the beam accepted each falling drop, sending a soft, rounded echo through the room. The night air cooled further, brushing across the paper walls in thin, steady currents. A faint shimmer of moonlight slipped through the narrow seam of the sliding door, forming a silver line across the wooden boards. It met the warmer lantern glow, blending into a muted patch of dim light that shifted whenever the flame moved. The monk watched the space where those two lights met, his breath steady and unhurried. The traveler adjusted their seat on the floor, drawing their robe more fully around their shoulders. Their hair, once heavy with rain, now dried in gentle waves that caught the lantern glow along the edges. They followed the movement of the bowl's surface as ripples spread from each falling drop. The sound was quiet but full, creating a soft circle of resonance that drifted outward, fading into the wooden walls. Outside, a breeze pushed through the bamboo grove. Leaves brushed against each other in faint murmurs, shaped by the slow passing of air through their hollow stalks. A single gust traveled along the walkway and found its way into the room through the sliding door's small gap. The lantern flame leaned in response. The shadows stretched across the floor in long, delicate lines. Nothing is required from you. The traveler looked toward the ceiling, where the thin thread of moisture continued its slow work along the beam. The droplet forming at its end had grown heavier, brightening with the lantern's warm reflection. It held steady, swelling a little more with each subtle shift of air, but still refusing to fall. The monk followed their gaze, watching as the drop trembled near the edge of letting go. A soft creak passed through the ceiling, subtle, almost hesitant. The wood adjusted to the cooler air, carrying the faint sound along the length of the beam. The traveler lowered their eyes again, resting them on the monk for a moment. Their posture eased, shoulders no longer lifted with the tension of arrival. A thin trail of warmth rose from their cup of tea, though the surface had already grown still and quiet. The bowl caught another drop, sending out a new ripple that traveled outward in smooth rings. The water inside glimmered faintly as the lantern flame flickered once more. The monk adjusted the bowl slightly, just enough to keep it centered beneath the falling drops should the leak shift again. He did so without hurry, his motion blending naturally into the room's slow rhythm. The traveler breathed in gently, letting the night air settle across their chest. They exhaled as mist gathered again outside the sliding door, drifting upward along the paper wall in soft spirals. The breeze carried the faint scent of wet bamboo into the room, mixing with the earthy warmth of tea still clinging to the clay cups. A low hum of wind brushed along the rafters, creating a subtle, wavering tone above their heads. Another shift passed through the wooden beam. The droplet overhead trembled more noticeably now, its weight nearly enough to free it from the wood. It reflected the lantern light in a small, flickering glow, its surface quivering with each whisper of wind entering the room. The monk rested his hands on his knees, watching the droplets' slow, patient gathering. The traveler lowered their gaze again, following the moonlight's thin trail across the floor. It stretched toward the bowl in a soft, silver ribbon, its brightness shifting as the lantern dimmed. The water inside the bowl trembled once, then stilled, its surface smoothing into a faint mirror that captured both moonlight and flame. Nothing is required from you. Outside, the bamboo moved again, their long shadows brushing across the courtyard stones. A soft wave of sound drifted through the open walkway, lifting the curtain of mist for a moment before allowing it to settle again. The wind traveled through the small seam of the door and slipped into the room, brushing the monk's sleeve and causing the flame to narrow into a thin, flickering line. The droplet overhead brightened as the lantern swayed. It hung from the seam with delicate persistence, round and full, holding the quiet weight of the night inside its trembling shape. It stayed there, unmoving, waiting on the edge of its fall. The night grew heavier around the temple, settling into its deepest hours with a calm that moved slowly through every beam and board. Rain had nearly stopped now, lingering only as scattered drops falling from the highest tiles, each one tracing a lone path through the cool air before finding stone or soil below. The monk's room absorbed this stillness, its lantern lowered to a soft, gentle glow that reached only the nearest walls. The bowl beneath the leak echoed at longer intervals now, each sound drifting through the dimness before fading. The traveler sat quietly beside the monk, their posture settled in a way it had not earlier in the night. Their robe lay loosely around them, the last of the moisture gone. Their gaze remained soft, following the movement of shadows that stretched and curled along the floor as the lantern swayed. Outside the sliding door, mist pressed lightly against the frame before lifting again in thin, wavering breaths. The ceiling creaked once, a faint shift in the wood that traveled from one side of the room to the other. The leak responded with a slower rhythm, as though the storm's fading presence had thinned the path of water traveling through the tiles. A drop formed along the beam, smaller than the others before it, and released itself with a soft tap into the bowl. The ripple it created was subtle, barely lifting the surface before disappearing. Nothing is required from you. The monk adjusted his position slightly, smoothing the fold of his robe along his leg. Lantern light slid gently across his sleeve before bending into the floorboards, leaving a warm patch that pulsed whenever the flame moved. Across from him, the traveler rested one hand on the wooden surface, palm open, fingers lightly curved. A long breath passed through the room, almost mirrored by the faint stir of wind that brushed the paper walls. The bamboo grove outside swayed with minimal sound now, their earlier rush softened into quiet, hesitant taps as the wind weakened. Leaves touched each other with delicate brushes that barely reached the room, but their presence lingered beneath the night's hush. A lone drop fell from a higher part of the roof, striking the walkway outside in a single, bright tick that echoed briefly through the corridor. The monk raised his eyes toward the beam where the leak had shifted. The last droplet forming there was thin, fragile, holding only a small glimmer of reflected light. It hesitated before falling, as though the roof itself were deciding where its final drops belonged. When it released, the bowl received it with a faint, softened note. The surface shimmered once more, then smoothed into stillness. Warmth from the lantern settled low, almost touching the base of the wooden frame. Its flame had grown smaller, glowing in shorter breaths, bending deeply each time the draft slipped under the door. Shadows stretched longer across the walls, forming gentle arcs that faded toward the corners where the room kept its deepest quiet. The traveler watched these shadows drift, blinking slowly as their body sank more comfortably into the cushion beneath them. A breeze reached the room from the courtyard, carrying the scent of wet stone and fading rain. It moved through the narrow seam of the door and brushed the bowls, the cups, the wooden table. The flame narrowed into a thin shape, almost a line, before recovering its roundness again. The traveler's hair swayed slightly with the movement, then fell still. The monk's breath remained steady. The leak weakened further. Instead of a steady rhythm, the drops now formed in long intervals, gathering slowly, one by one, along the uneven grain of the wood. A faint shimmer revealed the thin, retreating line of moisture across the beam. The wood appeared darker there, but drying at the edges, as though the storm's memory clung only lightly now. Another drop formed, barely enough to gather weight, then hesitated. Outside, the clouds drifted apart more fully. Moonlight brightened along the courtyard stones, sending a pale glow into the walkway that reached just far enough to appear at the bottom edge of the sliding door. Mist rose in faint spirals, stirred by the gentlest push of wind that slipped between the bamboo stalks. A long shadow bowed across the floor before thinning into the darker part of the room. The monk lowered his gaze again toward the bowl. Its surface reflected the lantern's small, trembling flame in a long, wavering line. Ripples had grown so infrequent now that the water lay nearly flat, a quiet mirror for the dim light inside the room. The traveler followed his eyes silently, watching the stillness settle deeper with each breath. Nothing is required from you. Above them, the beam shifted again with a soft creak. The final bead of water, faint and pale, clung to the rough edge of the wood. It captured a sliver of moonlight that entered through the narrow seam of the door, glinting in a way that was almost invisible except at certain angles. The droplet trembled where it hung, not yet falling, not yet gone, suspended at the edge of darkening wood as the room waited in its quiet. The night thinned slowly, its darkness becoming softer at the edges as the first hint of dawn touched the farthest line of the horizon. The courtyard outside the monk's room held a faint, muted glow that rose through the mist in pale layers. Rain had fully stopped now, leaving only the occasional drip falling from the highest corners of the roof, the sound gentle and sparse. The bowl beneath the beam sat nearly full, its surface smooth and dark, reflecting the lantern's small, wavering flame. The monk remained seated, his posture unchanged except for the quiet ease in his shoulders. The traveler sat nearby, their robe gathered loosely around them, warmed now by the hours spent inside. The lantern's flame had lowered to a faint, ember-bright glow, its warm circle shrinking on the wooden floor. Outside, the bamboo no longer moved. Not even the slightest breeze disturbed their tall silhouettes. Through the narrow seam of the sliding door, a thin band of pale light appeared. It stretched across the floorboards in a soft line, barely touching the edge of the bowl. The mingling of moonlight and the earliest dawn created a muted silver that shifted with the faintest tremble of mist outside. The traveler watched the light slowly widen, their gaze unhurried, their breath calm and even. Nothing is required from you. Above, the wooden beam held only the smallest trace of moisture, the storm's presence nearly gone. The last lingering droplet clung weakly to the underside of the wood, its glow dimmer now as the lantern softened and dawn grew. It trembled once, small and uncertain, but did not fall. The monk's eyes rested on it for a moment before drifting back to the bowl. A faint sound brushed the air outside, water slipping from a high tile onto stone. It echoed lightly through the still courtyard before dissolving into the early morning quiet. Mist curled along the base of the bamboo grove, rising in gentle spirals that thinned as they met the cool light of dawn. The sky remained mostly hidden by clouds, but the promise of morning pressed against them, softening their shape. The traveler lifted their hands slightly, palms open toward what little warmth remained in the lantern's glow. Their fingers moved just enough to feel the air shift around them. The monk refilled their cup with the last bit of tea from the pot, though the liquid had long since cooled. The sound of pouring water joined the room's gentle rhythm, then faded into the stillness. The bowl beneath the leak was now so full that each new ripple stretched all the way to its rim. The traveler leaned forward slightly, watching how the reflections moved across the surface. Lantern glow, the faint silver ribbon of dawn, and the soft shadow of the beam overhead all bending together. The water trembled with subtle motions, responding to shifts in the room too small to name. Outside, the shift in sky grew clearer. A soft, pale brightness rose behind the temple roofs, touching their edges with faint highlights. Droplets still clinging to the tiles shone briefly when the light found them. The bamboo grove took on a muted gray-green tone, its tall shapes no longer part of the night, but not yet fully claimed by morning. A low sigh traveled through the wood as one of the temple's rafters adjusted to the cool air. The monk placed his cup down carefully beside the traveler's. Both vessels reflected the same dimming lantern light, their rims catching it in slender crescents. The traveler's gaze returned to the ceiling, where the final droplet still held its fragile place on the beam. It quivered with a slight shimmer as dawn grew stronger. Nothing is required from you. The seam of the sliding door brightened further, filling with pale morning. The light stretched slowly across the floor, reaching toward the cushion where the monk sat. Mist outside began to thin, lifting upward in soft waves that drifted toward the higher air. The quiet of the temple held steady, untouched by movement or urgency. Inside the room, the droplet overhead swelled faintly as the wood warmed by a small degree under the first touch of daylight. Its shape grew rounder, clearer, more defined in the soft glow gathering beneath it. The bowl waited below, its surface trembling with each small shift of the lantern's final flame. The droplet clung there, shining with the first color of morning, holding itself one quiet moment longer at the edge of falling. The first color of morning settled gently across the temple, soft and muted, carrying none of the sharpness that daylight would later bring. It touched the courtyard stones with a pale glow, lingered on the edges of the bamboo leaves, and moved with quiet patience through the mist that drifted along the ground. The rain-washed roofs glistened faintly, each tile holding a trace of the night in its curved, darkened surface. Inside the monk's room, the lantern flame had thinned to a delicate thread of light. The monk and the traveler sat in the soft hush that follows a long storm. Their breaths rose and fell with even calm, blending seamlessly into the quiet that had filled the room since the leak began. The bowl beneath the beam was now full, its surface resting just below the rim. Reflections of dawn shimmered across it in trembling strokes of silver and gold. The soft ripple from the last falling drop stretched across the water before smoothing again into stillness. The ceiling above held little moisture now, The wood had begun to lighten as it dried, drawing the last of the rain back into its grain. A faint line marked the path the leak had traveled, a thin memory of where water once gathered. The final droplet that had clung to the beam was gone. Whether it had fallen or simply vanished into the warming air, neither the monk nor the traveler had noticed. Nothing is required from you. Mist curled along the sliding door as the breeze shifted gently outside. The pale morning light widened into the room, pressing softly against the paper walls until their surfaces glowed with a muted warmth. In the courtyard beyond, bamboo swayed with the faintest movement, as though adjusting themselves after the long wait of rain. The temple's wooden beams offered a low creak, a sound both settling and beginning. The traveler rested their hands on their knees, fingertips lightly brushing the folds of their robe. Their eyes followed the line of light stretching across the floor, watching how it crept quietly toward the bowl. The water inside trembled at the slightest disturbance, an invisible draft, a soft shift of weight, the last fading breath of the lantern. Its surface carried the night within it, the sound of rain, the rhythm of the leak, the muted glow of lantern light reflected again and again. The monk reached forward, cupping his hand around the lantern's base to shield the dim flame from a passing breeze. The flame flickered once, bowed low, and steadied. Its glow fell across the surface of the bowl, brightening the thin line where dawn and shadow met. He did not move the bowl or empty it. He simply watched the way morning gathered around it. Outside, a final drip fell from the highest corner of the roof. It landed on a stone and broke into a brief, shining spray before disappearing into the mist. The sound echoed faintly through the walkway, more delicate than any sound the storm had offered. Bamboo rustled softly, their leaves brushing in a slow, waking rhythm. Inside the room, the lantern dimmed again, its flame narrowing into a thin shape that wavered with each breath of the room. The monk folded his hands in his lap, sleeves settling gently along his arms. The traveler's shoulders eased further, their posture softening as the quiet deepened. The bowl rested between them, full and motionless. Nothing is required from you. The morning light reached the rim of the bowl. It glowed against the curved edge, creating a thin halo where brightness met water. The reflection shifted with the smallest tremble, forming delicate shapes that vanished as quickly as they formed. The water held still otherwise, revealing only the faint shimmer of the lantern in its deeper tones. A cool breeze eased into the room through the narrow seam of the door. It carried the scent of wet earth and the first warmth of morning. The lantern bowed once more, its flame bending toward the floor before rising again in a gentle arc. The traveler watched the movement in silence, their breath steady and soft. Outside, the mist began to lift. Thin threads of it rose toward the rooftops, catching the pale light in soft, drifting shapes that slowly unraveled into the air. A quiet hush wrapped around the temple, the kind that follows both rain and darkness. The bamboo leaned with the breeze, casting faint, wavering shadows through the walkway and onto the edge of the monk's floor. Inside, the bowl remained still, filled to its quiet brim with the night's long rhythm. Dawn touched its surface, creating a brightness that trembled gently in the fading lantern glow. The light shifted once, stretching across the water in a thin, wavering line that held for a long, soft moment before changing shape again.